I am Alana Stewart. The year I turned 25, I woke up from a grueling spinal surgery staring at the cold fluorescent ceiling tiles of an Ohio recovery room to find my parents had simply walked out. They left me immobilized in a rigid brace facing crushing medical debt, just to go drink champagne at my brother Derek's launch party for a logistics business bound to fail. The people who ended up staying by my side in that dark chapter were total strangers. 8 years later, I built a medical supply fortune worth $115 million right here in the Midwest. When my biological family finally came crawling back expecting a payout, I revealed exactly who was receiving every single dollar of that fortune, and their faces froze in a kind of shock I will savor for the rest of my life. Welcome back to Senior Echo Stories, where we explore the quiet strength of those pushed too far and the hard lessons learned by the families who pushed them. If stories of cold resilience and ultimate justice resonate with you, drop a comment below and hit that subscribe button. Let me take you back to that sterile hospital room where it all began. I remember the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor echoing in the quiet recovery ward. The anesthesia was just beginning to wear off, leaving a sharp, throbbing ache at the base of my spine. I was trapped in a heavy plastic brace, unable to turn my neck or shift my weight. A young nurse walked in her soft rubber shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. She checked my vitals and offered a sympathetic smile before I managed to ask through dry lips if my parents were in the waiting area. The nurse paused, her eyes dropping to the chart in her hands. She shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable. She gently explained that Brenda and Thomas had left hours ago. They had signed the preliminary emergency contact forms, handed the desk staff a generic excuse, and driven away. A crushing weight settled onto my chest, making it hard to draw a breath. I was facing months of brutal physical therapy and a mountain of medical bills that I had no clear way to pay. I needed a support system. I needed the people who raised me to simply sit in a chair and tell me I was going to heal. Instead, they chose to attend a networking event. Derek had rented out a local bar to celebrate the opening of a basic regional shipping franchise. My parents decided his moment of unearned glory was more pressing than their daughter waking up from an operation that carried a serious risk of paralysis. The physical pain in my back dulled compared to the sharp sting of the realization washing over me. I lay there immobilized, listening to the hum of the hospital machinery. Reaching for the phone on the bedside table felt like lifting a boulder, but I managed to grasp it. My fingers trembled as I dialed my mother's number. Brenda answered on the fourth ring. Loud party music and the clinking of glasses bled through the speaker. When I asked her why she left, her tone held no warmth. She sounded irritated that I was interrupting. She told me that Derek needed emotional support for his big day. She sighed deeply into the receiver and insisted that I was strong enough to handle a hospital stay alone. She casually told me to figure out my own discharge plan and hung up the phone. The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the thin hospital blanket. I did not scream for the nurse. I did not break down in tears. A profound, chilling clarity took root in my mind right then and there. This is the tragic reality for the capable child in a toxic family system. Society tells us that being independent is a virtue, but in families like mine, independence is weaponized against you. When you prove you can survive the storm, they decide you no longer require an umbrella. They funnel all their resources, all their praise, and all their presence into the child who constantly demands to be rescued. They punish you for your strength by denying you basic comfort. Staring at the blank television screen across the room, I made a silent vow. I would survive this hospital stay. I would rebuild my life from nothing, and I would do it without ever asking them for a single favor again. The next few days were a blur of agonizing pain and terrifying reality checks. The hospital social worker visited my room with a stack of paperwork outlining the estimated costs of my recovery. Even with my basic insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses were staggering. I needed specialized equipment, around-the-clock care for the first few weeks, and rigorous physical therapy. I had a modest savings account for my corporate job, but it would be drained within a month. My lease on my small apartment was ending soon, and I had no physical ability to pack boxes or move furniture. It was during these dark hours that a lifeline appeared from an entirely unexpected source. Her name was Joyce. She was a veteran hospital physical therapist with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and a no-nonsense approach to her job. Joyce was the one tasked with getting me out of bed for the first time. The pain of putting weight on my legs was blinding, but Joyce held me steady. Over the course of a week, she guided me down the hallway step by painful step. Joyce was observant. She noticed the empty chairs in my room. She saw that there were no greeting cards on my windowsill, no flowers on the tray table, and no family members rushing in during visiting hours to relieve the silence. One afternoon, while she was helping me adjust my back brace, she asked bluntly where my people were. I told her the truth. I explained the phone call, the logistics party, and the undeniable fact that I had nowhere safe to be discharged to. I expected pity. I expected her to offer a polite, meaningless apology and move on to her next patient. Instead, Joyce finished securing the straps on my brace and left the room. She returned the next morning with her retired husband, David. David was a quiet man with kind eyes and hands roughened by years of honest labor. They stood at the foot of my hospital bed, and without a trace of hesitation, they offered me the spare bedroom in their modest suburban home. They explained that their own children had moved across the country years ago, and the house was too quiet anyway. David offered to build a custom ramp for the front steps, and Joyce promised to oversee my daily exercises off the clock. I hesitated. My entire life had conditioned me to believe that every act of kindness carried a hidden invoice waiting to be collected. I waited for the catch. I asked them how much rent they expected and how I could possibly repay the medical oversight. David simply smiled and told me that nobody keeps score when someone needs a roof. I accepted their offer. 2 days later, David pulled his sturdy sedan up to the hospital entrance. He carefully helped me into the passenger seat while Joyce handled my sparse belongings. Driving away from that hospital, I realized my biological family had fully erased me from their narrative, but a new foundation was already being poured. Blood makes you related, but loyalty is what makes you family. The door clicked shut behind the young nurse, leaving me in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight resting on my chest. The rhythmic hum of the heart monitor and the faint hiss of the oxygen filter were the only sounds proving I was still tethered to the world. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint water stains on the sterile white tiles, trying to make sense of the void my parents had just carved out in my life. Reaching for the plastic phone on the bedside table required an agonizing effort. My spine was locked in a rigid plastic brace, and every tiny shift of my weight sent sharp electrical shocks firing down my legs. But I needed to hear it from their own mouths. I needed to understand how a mother and a father could justify abandoning their daughter hours after a surgeon had sliced her back open. My fingers fumbled with the oversized buttons on the hospital phone. I dialed my mother's personal cell number from memory. The ringing stretched out, making each tone feel longer and more punishing than the last. She answered on the fifth ring, and the stark contrast of her environment hit me like a physical blow. A sudden burst of loud bass-heavy party music poured through the tiny speaker. I could hear booming laughter, clinking glasses, and the overlapping chatter of a crowded festive room. It sounded like a celebration. It sounded like a victory party. "Mom," I said, my voice raspy and weak from the breathing tube they had removed just hours earlier. "Where are you?" Alana, a heavy, impatient sigh traveled across the line. It was the exact kind of sigh someone reserves for a persistent telemarketer or a minor inconvenience. I told the front desk we had to go. We are at the country club. Derek investor launch just started, and the caterers were running late, so I had to step in and manage the crisis. I gripped the plastic receiver tightly. My knuckles turned stark white against the gray hospital bedding. I was lying in a recovery ward, staring at an intravenous drip feeding painkillers directly into my vein. My mother was managing a catering crisis at an upscale country club for a local shipping franchise. "You left the hospital," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. You left while I was still unconscious in the recovery bay. The surgeon said I needed a discharge supervisor. Oh, please, Alana. Her voice turned sharp, dripping with that familiar, condescending edge I had known my entire life. You are 25 years old. You have always been the independent one. The doctor said the procedure went fine. You just need to rest and do some basic exercises. Derek needed us tonight. This is his big debut in the corporate world. He has investors looking at him, and he gets so anxious when he does not have his support system around him. His support system. The words hung in the sterile air between us. Derek was 28 years old. He had bounced from one failed startup venture to another, burning through our parents' retirement funds, and expecting a standing ovation every time he managed to tie his own shoes. I had paid my own way through college, built a solid career in corporate logistics, and asked them for nothing. Now facing the most terrifying medical crisis of my life, I had finally asked for them to simply sit in a waiting room and be parents. Mom. I cannot even sit up, I said, stripping away my pride. I cannot walk to the bathroom without assistance. The hospital social worker is coming with discharge papers, and I have no way to get home. I have an empty apartment on the 3rd floor with no elevator. The dance music in the background swelled louder. I heard my father laugh, a booming, hearty sound in the distance. He was having a wonderful time. You will figure it out, Brenda replied, the irritation in her voice morphing into a cold and final command. You always figure it out. Talk to the nurses. They have programs for this sort of thing. Call a medical transport van. We cannot leave your brother on his most important night to hold your hand in a hospital room when you are already in recovery. Stop being so dramatic, Alana. We will call you tomorrow when things settle down. Before I could form another word, the line clicked. The dial tone buzzed flat and indifferent against my ear. I did not pull the phone away from my face immediately. I let that steady, dead sound fill my head. It matched the hollow feeling expanding in my stomach. When I finally let my arm drop, the plastic receiver clattered against the metal bed rail and dangled by its cord, swinging back and forth. I closed my eyes. The sharp sting of tears threatened to gather, but I forced them back. Crying was a biological response to seeking comfort, and I had just been given the ultimate undeniable proof that no comfort was ever coming from them. If I cried, I would be mourning a mother and father who did not actually exist. I would be weeping for a fantasy. That is the insidious trap of growing up in a toxic family dynamic. You spend your entire life trying to earn a place at a table where the chairs were never meant to hold you. You become the quiet child, the high achiever, the one who requires no maintenance, just to prove you are worthy of their time. Meanwhile, the child who constantly creates chaos absorbs every single drop of their attention and resources. My parents did not view my strength as a virtue. They viewed it as a convenience. It meant I was one less burden they had to manage. Laying in that sterile room, a profound shift occurred within me. The desperate yearning for parental love, the instinct that begs for a mother when you are wounded, simply evaporated. It was not replaced by fiery rage or a desire to scream and throw things across the room. It was replaced by a chilling, enduring silence. I looked at the ceiling tiles again, but the blurry shapes began to look different. They were no longer the ceiling of a trap. They were the starting line. I had an expiring apartment lease, a dwindling savings account, and a broken spine. But I also possessed a mind that knew how to solve intricate problems. My mother was right about one thing. I always figured it out. And I was going to figure this out with a silent, fierce vengeance. I mentally calculated my assets. I had my laptop in my overnight bag. I had my sharp analytical skills. I understood the corporate supply chain from my previous job. And most importantly, I was no longer weighed down by the heavy emotional anchor of seeking my parents' approval. I severed the tie in my own mind right then and there. They chose Derek and his rented country club party. They chose the illusion of success over their daughter lying broken in a hospital bed. Staring at the clunky, poorly designed back brace strapping me to the mattress, an idea began to form. I noticed the inefficient straps, the cheap plastic joints, and the uncomfortable padding. I realized the medical equipment industry was full of flaws waiting to be fixed. I promised myself that I would construct a life so insulated, so successful, and so impenetrable that Brenda and Thomas would never be able to reach me again. I would not block their numbers or announce my grand departure. I would simply fade out of their reality and build my empire in the shadows. The strategic silence began the moment I pulled the call cord to summon the nurse back into the room. It is fascinating how the most devastating betrayals often turn into the very fuel we need to build our greatest victories. Have you ever experienced a moment so painful that it instantly stripped away all your illusions about a family member you loved? Did that sudden cold reality break your spirit? Or did it give you the exact clarity you needed to change your entire path? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because the way we handle those turning points defines everything that comes next. I chose to build, and I was about to meet the people who would show me what a real family actually looks like. David navigated the quiet residential streets of their Ohio neighborhood with deliberate care. He avoided every visible pothole, knowing that even the slightest jolt in the sedan sent a wave of fire radiating up my damaged spine. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, encased in the suffocating plastic of my medical brace, staring out the window. The suburban landscape blurred past me. Lawns were neatly trimmed, and bicycles rested on front porches, painting a picture of domestic tranquility that felt entirely foreign to my current reality. When David finally pulled into his driveway, he put the car in park and turned off the ignition. I looked toward the front door, and my breath hitched in my throat. Resting over the concrete front steps was a freshly constructed wooden ramp. The plywood was still pale and raw. Sawdust clung to the edges of the safety rails. David had spent his entire weekend building a custom access ramp for a young woman he had only met 3 days prior. My hands gripped the door handle. I stared at those wooden planks, and my mind scrambled to calculate the cost. Growing up in my childhood home, every single gesture carried a specific price tag. If my mother baked my favorite pie, it meant she was softening me up to ask for a loan to cover another one of Derek's failed business ventures. If my father fixed a flat tire on my car, he would remind me of his labor at every holiday dinner for the next 5 years. Generosity was merely a transactional tool used to secure future leverage. David walked around the car and opened my door. He offered his steady arm, and I leaned into his strength, slowly maneuvering my rigid body out of the seat. I looked at him, and then at the new ramp. I immediately started stumbling over my words, apologizing for the expense and promising to reimburse him for the lumber out of my dwindling savings account. David just shook his head gently. He guided me toward the incline and told me that lumber is cheap, but a safe entry is priceless. He said they wanted me to focus on walking again, not on settling imaginary debts. The interior of their home smelled of ground cinnamon and old books. It was a modest single-story house filled with worn, comfortable furniture and framed photographs of laughing grandchildren. Joyce had prepared the spare bedroom with meticulous attention to detail. The bed was positioned at the exact height necessary for my restricted mobility. A stack of clean towels sat folded on a nearby chair, and a glass of fresh water rested on the nightstand. Joyce helped me transition from my walker to the edge of the mattress. The physical exertion of the car ride and the short walk had drained every ounce of my energy. My muscles trembled and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. She expertly adjusted my pillows, elevating my legs to relieve the intense pressure on my lower back. I sat there surrounded by their profound kindness, and I felt a sudden overwhelming urge to flee. My pride flared up like a defensive shield. I had spent my entire life learning to be self-sufficient, to never require anything from anyone so I could avoid the sting of inevitable disappointment. Accepting this level of care from 2 strangers felt terrifying. It felt like walking onto thin ice without knowing the depth of the water below. I looked at Joyce and told her I could handle the rest. I insisted I would find a way to work remotely and pay them a proper monthly rent. I was rambling, trying to establish a business arrangement to protect my fragile emotions. Joyce placed a warm hand over my trembling fingers. She looked me directly in the eyes with the piercing intuition of a woman who had spent decades watching patients battle both physical trauma and internal demons. She told me that healing requires surrendering control. She explained that true strength is not about enduring agony in isolation, but having the courage to let someone else carry the weight when your own legs falter. Joyce said they opened their door because they saw a young woman who needed a safe harbor, and they asked for nothing in return except my dedication to the recovery process. For the first time since waking up in the recovery room, the invisible armor I wore began to crack. I nodded silently, unable to form another word, as exhaustion finally pulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. The following weeks tested the very limits of my endurance. Recovery from spinal surgery is an ugly, unglamorous process. It is measured in inches and degrees of pain. Every morning at dawn, Joyce transformed their cozy living room into a makeshift rehabilitation clinic. We worked through grueling, repetitive exercises designed to wake up the dormant nerves in my legs and stabilize my core. There were mornings when the pain was so severe, I could barely draw a breath without sobbing. The sharp electrical shocks in my lower back felt like hot needles piercing my skin. During those agonizing sessions, Joyce never pitied me. She pushed me with firm, relentless encouragement. She demanded that I breathe through the fire, refusing to let me succumb to the despair threatening to pull me under. David provided the quiet, steady rhythm of the household. He cooked nourishing meals and left warm bowls of soup on my bedside table without expecting a grand display of gratitude. He researched the best dietary supplements for bone healing and quietly stocked the kitchen with everything I needed. He fixed a loose hinge on my walker so it would glide smoother across the carpet. They functioned as a seamless unit, providing a foundation of unconditional support. As the days turned into weeks, I kept bracing myself for the inevitable catch. I waited for the heavy sigh, the subtle guilt trip, or the sudden demand for repayment. It never came. The transactional anxiety that had governed my entire life slowly began to dissolve. I realized that my biological parents had taught me a distorted, tragic version of love. They had convinced me that affection was a limited resource to be hoarded and bargained with. Joyce and David showed me that real love flows freely, and its only agenda is the well-being of the person receiving it. But just as my emotional walls began to crumble, a new terrifying reality started to cast a dark shadow over my fragile progress. The mail began to arrive. David brought a stack of forwarded envelopes to my room one Tuesday afternoon. The return addresses bore the sterile logos of the hospital, the surgical center, and the anesthesiology group. My basic corporate health insurance had covered a fraction of the total cost, but the remaining out-of-pocket expenses were catastrophic. I sat on the edge of the bed, opening envelope after envelope. The numbers printed in bold black ink stared back at me like a death sentence. Tens of thousands of dollars for the operating room, exorbitant fees for the specialized hardware holding my spine together, daily charges for the recovery ward. My modest savings would not even cover the interest on these mounting debts. The sheer terror of financial ruin gripped my chest tighter than the heavy plastic brace encasing my torso. The brace itself was becoming an agonizing problem. As my mobility slowly increased, the rigid, generic design of the recovery gear dug brutally into my ribs and hips. The cheap industrial plastic caused painful friction sores on my skin. The straps frequently loosened, failing to provide the critical support my spine needed during the intense physical therapy sessions. I sat in the quiet spare room, holding a newly arrived medical bill in one hand and pressing the other against the chafing edge of my poorly constructed back brace. The physical agony and the financial terror merged into a singular, burning focal point. The standard equipment prescribed to millions of patients was tragically flawed and outrageously expensive. I traced the rigid, uncomfortable lines of the plastic shell. My background in logistics and supply chain efficiency sparked to life. I realized I was wearing a poorly designed product that desperately needed a revolution, and I was running out of time to secure my own survival. I grabbed a cheap wire-bound notepad from the nightstand and began to draw. The cheap wire-bound notepad became my singular refuge. I sat on the edge of the spare bed, gripping a pen until my knuckles turned white, sketching the rigid contours of the back brace that was causing me so much agony. I mapped out the friction points where the industrial plastic dug into my ribs and hips. I drew lines indicating where the straps failed to provide adequate lumbar support during my physical therapy sessions. My background in corporate logistics had trained me to identify inefficiencies in supply chains, but now I was applying that same analytical rigor to a flawed medical device. The hospital had charged my insurance an exorbitant fee for a piece of equipment that felt like a medieval torture device. I knew there had to be a more ergonomic way to stabilize a healing spine. Morning after morning, I endured the grueling reality of physical rehabilitation. Joyce treated our sessions with clinical precision, turning her suburban Ohio living room into a rigorous training ground. She would wrap a thick canvas gait belt around my waist and coax me upward. The physical exertion required just to stand sent waves of nauseating pain radiating down my legs. My muscles had atrophied during the long hospital stay, and every step felt like wading through wet cement. Joyce never offered empty platitudes. She demanded focus. She pushed me to take one more step when my knees threatened to buckle, reminding me that progress is forged in the fire of discomfort. The physical battle was agonizing, but the psychological war was equally severe. The hospital billing department operates without empathy. The collection calls began exactly 1 month after my surgery. The phone on my nightstand would ring, and a sterile, rehearsed voice on the other end would demand payment plans I could not fathom affording. The out-of-pocket expenses for the surgical suite, the titanium rods, and the anesthesia were staggering. Every ring of the phone felt like a physical blow. The crushing weight of the American healthcare system was threatening to drown me before I could even learn to walk independently again. I had no income, and my meager savings were vanishing. I channeled that mounting terror directly into my notepad. I ripped out pages of flawed designs and started over calculating weight distribution and breathable materials. David found me at the kitchen table one snowy afternoon, surrounded by crude blueprints and discarded pencil shavings. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned over my shoulder, studying the intricate sketches. David was a quiet man who had spent 40 years working the assembly lines at an automotive plant in Toledo. He understood manufacturing tolerances. He recognized the difference between a theoretical design and a functional prototype. He tapped a grease-stained finger on a drawing of a modified lumbar hinge. He told me the angle was brilliant, but the material I had listed would snap under consistent pressure. He suggested using a high-density thermoplastic polymer instead. He offered to clear off his workbench in the detached garage and see if we could turn my frantic sketches into something tangible. That drafty garage became the birthplace of my future empire. We worked side by side, bundled in heavy winter coats, with a single space heater humming in the corner. The physical toll of standing at the workbench was immense. My spine screamed in protest after just 20 minutes of standing, but my ambition refused to let me sit down. I was fighting the severe limitations of my own broken body while simultaneously laying the groundwork for my survival. I refused to be a victim of my circumstances or my biological family. I poured every ounce of my betrayal and anger into measuring, cutting, and sanding. We repurposed materials David had salvaged over the years. We used heat guns to bend and mold the industrial plastics, conforming the shape to mimic the natural curvature of the human spine. We scavenged premium memory foam from high-end automotive upholstery to line the interior, replacing the abrasive padding used in the standard hospital gear. We engineered a proprietary strapping system that utilized industrial-grade Velcro and reinforced nylon webbing, ensuring the brace would remain secure without restricting basic breathing. The conflict within me raged daily. There were evenings when I collapsed onto the spare bed, shivering from the profound exhaustion of healing and building. I doubted myself in the dark. I wondered if I was simply distracting myself from the grim reality of my financial ruin by playing inventor in a cold garage. The collection notices kept piling up on the kitchen counter, serving as a relentless reminder that the clock was ticking. If this prototype failed, I would be left destitute with ruined credit and a body that could barely support itself. After 3 weeks of relentless trial and error, David handed me the finished product. It was rough around the edges and lacked the polished sheen of commercial medical equipment, but the engineering was sound. I unfastened the generic hospital brace, tossing it onto the concrete floor with a deep sense of satisfaction. With David standing by to steady me, I strapped our prototype around my torso and pulled the nylon adjustments tight. The immediate relief brought tears to my eyes. The weight of my upper torso was evenly distributed across my hips, alleviating the brutal pressure on my healing vertebrae. The memory foam contoured perfectly to my sides, sparing my skin from the agonizing friction sores I had endured for months. I took a hesitant step across the garage floor and then another. The brace moved with me, providing unparalleled stability without feeling like a plastic cage. We brought the prototype inside to show Joyce. She examined the hinge placement and the foam density with a highly critical clinical eye. She asked me to sit, stand, and twist gently. Her professional skepticism slowly gave way to sheer astonishment. She told me she had spent 3 decades fitting patients with post-operative gear, and she had never seen a design that offered such intuitive structural support. She stated plainly that my garage project was vastly superior to the expensive gear peddled by major medical corporations. A quiet electric thrill coursed through my veins. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I had not just created a personal remedy to ease my own suffering. I had engineered a highly viable product that could revolutionize patient recovery. I held the blueprint for a legitimate business in my hands. The trauma my parents had abandoned me to endure was transforming into the very innovation that could set me free. But a brilliant prototype means nothing without capital and distribution. Building a single brace out of salvaged parts in an Ohio garage was one thing. Manufacturing medical-grade equipment, navigating federal health regulations, and securing bulk orders required significant funding. I was a 25-year-old woman with an empty bank account and an expanding mountain of medical debt. The financial walls were closing in fast, just as I had found the door out. The stakes elevated the very next morning. I received a final warning letter from a relentless collection agency threatening to initiate legal proceedings that could garnish any future wages I might earn. The pressure was suffocating. Joyce mentioned that the director of a prominent local rehabilitation clinic was complaining about back-ordered supplies and faulty braces. It was a rare opening. I had one singular, desperate chance to pitch my prototype to a medical buyer before the debt collectors dragged me into court. Have you ever been pushed to the absolute edge, where the only way out was to build your own escape route from scratch? When the people who were supposed to catch you let you fall, did you surrender to the impact, or did you learn how to turn your lowest moment into your greatest weapon? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because the resilience we find at rock bottom defines our true character and shapes our ultimate destiny. The fluorescent lights of the Ohio Rehabilitation Clinic buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the waiting room. I sat in a vinyl chair holding a sleek black folder that contained my newly approved patent documents and the technical specifications for my ergonomic back brace. Underneath my tailored blouse, I was wearing the very prototype David and I had engineered in his drafty garage. The receptionist finally called my name, pointing me toward the purchasing director office. I stood up and walked across the room without a single flinch of pain. The brace supported my healing spine flawlessly. The director was a stern man who had spent 20 years reviewing medical supply catalogs. He sat behind a heavy oak desk, looking skeptical as I laid my prototype in front of him. I did not rely on emotional appeals or desperate sales tactics. I simply explained the biomechanics of the high-density polymer and demonstrated the industrial Velcro strapping system. I showed him how the memory foam lining eliminated the friction sores that plagued his current patients. The director ran his hands over the reinforced stitching. He recognized the superior craftsmanship immediately. He agreed to purchase 10 units for a trial run. That modest sale felt like a monumental triumph. I took the check directly to the bank and transferred every single penny straight into the raw materials account. 2 weeks later, the director called me with results that exceeded my most optimistic projections. The patients using my braces were reporting significant pain reduction, and their mobility metrics were improving faster than the clinic average. The superior lumbar support was accelerating their physical therapy timelines. The director did not just praise the design. He placed a formal order for 200 units to supply their entire regional network. I hung up the phone and stared at the order confirmation on my laptop screen. The sheer scale of the request was daunting. Fulfilling an order of that size required specialized manufacturing molds, bulk synthetic materials, and professional assembly labor. The revenue from the initial 10 units barely covered the cost of securing the patent. I needed a substantial influx of capital to bring the company out of the garage and into a legitimate production facility. As I sat at the kitchen table crunching the daunting numbers, David walked in from the porch carrying the Daily Mail. He handed me a stack of envelopes. Most of them were manufacturing quotes and supplier catalogs, but one envelope stood out. It was a thick, square envelope made of premium cardstock. I recognized the neat, elegant handwriting immediately. It was my mother. I opened the flap and pulled out a generic holiday greeting card. The front featured a pristine, snow-covered cabin surrounded by evergreen trees. Inside, the printed message wished the recipient a season of joy and prosperity. Below the sterile text, Brenda and Thomas had simply signed their names in blue ink. There was no handwritten note. There was no inquiry about my spinal surgery or my grueling rehabilitation. There was no return address listed on the envelope. The card was a masterclass in toxic family dynamics. It is a phenomenon that occurs when estranged parents want to alleviate their own lingering guilt without actually doing the difficult work of repairing the damage they caused. They send a hollow, performative gesture into the void. It allows them to tell their social circle that they reached out and tried to maintain a connection. It shifts the blame onto the discarded child. By providing no return address, they ensure that a genuine conversation cannot take place. They had written me off. They assumed I was still impoverished, broken, and struggling to survive in some rundown apartment. They sent the card to check a box on their moral ledger and then closed the book on my existence. I held the heavy cardstock in my hands, feeling the textured ridges of the fake snow on the cover. I felt no sorrow and no lingering desire to chase their approval. The psychological grip they once held over my life had fully evaporated. I walked over to the kitchen trash can and dropped the card in. I did not give them another second of my mental energy. My focus belonged entirely to the 200-unit order glowing on my computer screen. Later that evening, Joyce and David joined me at the kitchen table. They saw the complex spreadsheets and the manufacturing quotes scattered across the wood. They listened quietly as I explained the financial hurdle standing between my proven prototype and a lucrative regional contract. I told them I was looking into high-interest business loans to secure the necessary funding. David exchanged a long, meaningful look with Joyce. He stood up and walked over to the vintage wooden desk in the corner of the living room. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a simple leather checkbook. He returned to the table and began writing. He tore the slip of paper from the binding and slid it across the table toward me. I looked down at the numbers and my breath caught in my throat. It was a check for $50,000. It was the entirety of their retirement savings. It was the money they had carefully hoarded over 4 decades of working factory shifts and managing hospital wards. I pushed the check back toward him, shaking my head. I told them I could not accept their nest egg. The risk of a new manufacturing venture was too steep, and I refused to jeopardize the security of the only people who had given me a safe harbor. Joyce pushed the check firmly back into my hands. She told me that biological families often view their children as risky investments, holding their support hostage until a return is guaranteed. She said that chosen families operate differently. They do not bet on the odds, they bet on the person. Joyce explained that they had watched me drag my broken body out of bed every single morning at dawn. They had witnessed my relentless drive in that freezing garage. They knew I would succeed because they saw my character in the dark when nobody else was watching. I sat in the quiet suburban kitchen holding the check that would launch my empire. I did not offer them a hollow emotional speech. I looked at the 2 strangers who had become my true parents and made a silent, ironclad vow. I would take their blind faith and multiply it 1,000 times over. I would build a fortune so vast that they would never have to worry about a single expense for the rest of their natural lives. The next morning, I leased a small industrial workspace on the outskirts of the city. I purchased the heavy-duty sewing machines and the specialized thermoplastic molds required for commercial production. I hired a small team of skilled assembly workers and trained them to execute my exact ergonomic specifications. My medical supply company officially launched, moving out of the residential garage and into the competitive healthcare market. The contrast between my silent, grinding ascent and my biological family, arrogant dismissal was stark. Brenda and Thomas were going about their lives in their affluent social circles, complaining about their difficult daughter while funding my brother failing logistics franchise. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that I was rapidly securing statewide distribution contracts. The revenue began to compound, and the company valuation surged upward. The tension of my hidden success hummed beneath the surface of my daily life, setting the stage for the inevitable moment when the truth would finally reach them. Time moves differently when you are building a fortress from the ground up. 4 years slipped by in a blur of ringing telephones, late-night contract reviews, and the rhythmic hum of industrial machinery. I spent countless hours sitting in sterile conference rooms across the Midwest, pitching my ergonomic back brace to skeptical orthopedic surgeons and hospital purchasing directors. They would cross their arms and examine my polymer hinges, expecting another flimsy generic product. I watched their expressions shift from clinical doubt to undeniable surprise as they tested the tension straps and felt the memory foam lining. The generic medical supply companies could not compete with a product engineered from actual patient trauma. We expanded from that single drafty garage into a sprawling manufacturing facility within 18 months. I hired dozens of local workers providing good wages and comprehensive health benefits. The shipping dock became a constant flurry of activity, with forklifts loading heavy pallets of our ergonomic gear bound for national hospital networks. The numbers in the corporate ledger climbed steadily, crossing into the tens of millions. It was a staggering level of financial success that required relentless focus and meticulous management. With that level of market dominance came the inevitable knock of public recognition. Industry magazines sent eager reporters wanting to feature the young woman disrupting the healthcare supply chain. Regional business journals sent daily requests for glossy photo shoots and keynote speaking engagements at major medical conferences. I declined every single request. I instructed my public relations manager to issue polite but firm rejections to any media outlet that inquired about the founder. I created a series of corporate entities with vague, sterile names to hold the valuable patents and shield my personal identity. I even appointed a seasoned executive to act as the public face of the company during major industry conventions. My reasoning was rooted in basic survival. My biological parents were still living just a few counties away in their affluent suburban neighborhood. Brenda and Thomas operated entirely on the currency of social status and public validation. If they saw my face on the cover of a magazine or heard my name associated with a highly lucrative enterprise, their greed would activate instantly. They would construct a fictional narrative about how they supported my early dreams and financed my recovery. They would attempt to leverage my hard-earned wealth to fund my brother and his failing business ventures. I wanted to enjoy my peace undisturbed by their toxic demands and fabricated affection. Staying in the shadows was a highly calculated tactical decision. It allowed me to accumulate lasting power without alerting the very people who would naturally try to siphon it away. The wealth continued to compound, but I did not spend it on flashy sports cars or designer clothing. I funneled the profits into securing a permanent sanctuary for the people who actually mattered in my life. I spent my rare weekends driving through the quiet rural counties of Ohio, searching for the perfect location. I eventually found a sprawling piece of property tucked behind a dense line of ancient oak trees. It featured a winding gravel driveway, a private fishing pond, and a sturdy stone house with a wide wraparound porch. The estate was not gaudy or loud. It was a fortress designed for deep, peaceful exhalations away from the scrutinizing eyes of the world. The day the property deed cleared, I drove straight to the modest home where Joyce and David lived. They were sitting on their worn sofa drinking tea and watching the evening news, just like they did every night. I walked into their living room and handed David a thick manila envelope containing the title to the estate and a set of heavy brass keys. I told them to pack their bags because we were going home. They looked at the paperwork in stunned disbelief, but I refused to take no for an answer. They had given me a safe harbor when I was broken and destitute. It was my turn to provide them with the paradise they deserved. Watching David and Joyce walk through the tall wooden front doors of the estate brought a warmth to my chest that no corporate milestone could ever match. David immediately claimed the oversized detached barn in the back, setting up a sophisticated woodshop. He spent his mornings building intricate birdhouses and repairing antique furniture with a gentle smile on his face. Joyce took over the expansive gourmet kitchen, filling the stone house with the rich aroma of baked bread and simmering stews. We ate dinner together every single night at a long rustic wooden table overlooking the quiet pond. There were no hidden agendas and no subtle guilt trips served with our meals. We just shared stories and laughed until our ribs ached. During the holidays, our home was filled with genuine warmth instead of the cold transactional tension I had endured throughout my childhood. Joyce and David were my true parents in every way that counted. They celebrated my business victories without ever asking for a piece of the pie or taking credit for my intellect. I quietly set up a secure retirement trust in their names, ensuring they would never have to worry about a medical bill or a utility payment for the rest of their natural lives. We lived a beautifully insulated life shielded from the chaotic noise of the outside world. The crisp autumn air in Ohio brought a sense of profound physical and emotional healing. I could walk for miles around the perimeter of the private pond without feeling a single twinge of pain in my spine. The titanium rods and the early struggles were just distant memories. I had rewired my brain to accept unconditional love without bracing for an impending punishment. The nightmares of waking up alone in that sterile recovery room slowly faded into oblivion. Yet beneath the daily tranquility, a quiet tension lingered in the back of my mind. I knew the fragile bubble of our hidden paradise could not last forever. Somewhere across the state, Brenda and Thomas were going about their superficial lives, attending country club dinners and bragging about my brother. Derek was struggling to keep his logistics franchise afloat, running out of other people's money to burn. The profound irony of our situations was not lost on me. My family had deemed me a bad investment when I was lying broken in a hospital bed. They refused to offer me a simple couch to sleep on, claiming I was a burden they could not afford. Now I was the sole owner of a national supply chain empire, and they were blissfully ignorant to my existence. They still pictured me as the desperate 25-year-old girl they had abandoned without a second thought. They believed they held the moral high ground, assuming I was drowning in debt and professional failure. The silence of those 4 years was heavy with unspoken anticipation. It was the deep-drawn breath before a devastating hurricane strikes the coast. I focused on my work and my chosen family, but I always knew the clock was ticking in the background. The universe has a funny way of bringing the truth to light when people least expect it. The inevitable collision of our two realities was approaching faster than any of us realized. I kept building my fortress brick by brick, knowing that one day they would try to break the door down. I just made sure the locks were forged from iron. The cramped, windowless back office of Derek Logistics franchise smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The fluorescent overhead light flickered, casting a sickly yellow hue over the stack of past due notices covering his desk. His collar was stained with nervous sweat. The grand business venture he had launched years ago, the very same venture my parents had prioritized over my spinal surgery, was currently bleeding money. He had lost 2 of his 3 major delivery contracts in the past quarter, and the bank was threatening to call in the business loan my mother and father had co-signed. The pressure was suffocating him. He was a man accustomed to having his mistakes erased by our parents' checkbook. But Brenda and Thomas were running out of liquid funds to cover his constant financial blunders. He stared at the glowing monitor of his laptop, He was scrolling frantically through digital financial journals and industry news portals, searching for any sign of a market shift that could save him. He was hunting for a miracle. His eyes darted across headlines about shipping trends and corporate mergers. That is when a specific featured article caught his attention. It was highlighted on the front page of a prominent Midwest business journal. The bold text detailed a staggering corporate acquisition within the regional healthcare sector. A major health conglomerate had just purchased a homegrown Ohio medical supply firm for the sum of $115 million. The sheer scale of the number made Derek pause. He clicked the link, hoping to find some insight into how a local startup had managed to secure such an astronomical valuation. He read the opening paragraphs detailing the rapid rise of an ergonomic recovery brace that had revolutionized patient physical therapy across the nation. The article praised the intuitive design and the brilliant supply chain execution. Derek scrolled down to the founder profile, expecting to see a seasoned medical executive. Instead, his blood ran cold. The breath hitched in his throat as his eyes locked onto the crisp professional portrait embedded in the digital page. The woman in the photo possessed a sharp, focused gaze. She was dressed in a tailored blazer, radiating an aura of undeniable authority and quiet power. Derek recognized the determined set of her jaw and the familiar slope of her cheekbones. It was his sister. It was me. Derek pushed his chair back from the desk, his hands trembling slightly. He read the name printed beneath the photograph twice just to be sure his desperate mind was not playing tricks on him. Alana Stewart. The article detailed my journey, describing how I had engineered the initial prototype in a suburban garage following a severe spinal injury. Every single detail aligned perfectly. The timeline matched the exact year he had hosted his lavish launch party. The injury matched the very surgical recovery they had abandoned me to face alone. A normal brother might have felt a profound sense of shame or regret in that moment. A healthy family member would have recognized the deep irony of the situation. He was drowning in debt from the business they chose over me, while I had built an empire from the trauma they left me to endure. But toxic entitlement leaves no room for genuine remorse. Derek did not feel guilt. He felt an instantaneous, overwhelming surge of greed. He saw the figure of $115 million, and his mind immediately categorized it as family money. In his distorted reality, my success was not a testament to my isolated resilience. It was a resource that he inherently deserved a piece of. He picked up his cell phone with shaking fingers and dialed our parents' number. Brenda and Thomas were sitting in their pristine living room when the phone rang. They were enjoying a quiet afternoon, likely discussing which country club event they would attend that weekend to maintain their facade of upper-middle-class prosperity. Thomas answered the call, putting it on speaker so Brenda could hear. Derek did not bother with pleasantries. He blurted out the news in a rushed, breathless tone. He told them to open their tablet and go to the primary financial news website. He told them that the daughter they had written off as a lost cause had just sold a company for a fortune. Brenda scoffed, initially dismissing the claim as one of his anxious exaggerations. She reached for the tablet resting on the coffee table and navigated to the site. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the web page loaded. Brenda and Thomas stared at the screen, their eyes tracing the same bold headline and the same professional portrait that had just paralyzed their son. The color drained from my mother's face, the wine glass in her hand tilted dangerously close to spilling on her expensive rug. For years, she and my father had controlled the narrative. They had spun a convenient fiction to their friends, portraying me as a difficult, estranged child who refused to integrate into their loving family dynamic. They had convinced themselves that I was struggling somewhere out in the world, paying the ultimate price for not catering to their demands. Now, staring at a 9-figure acquisition, their entire carefully constructed reality fractured. The discarded daughter was not broken. She was thriving on a level they could not even begin to comprehend. This is the fascinating psychology of estranged abusers when confronted with the undeniable triumph of their victim. They experience a brief, terrifying moment of cognitive dissonance. The person they deemed worthless has proven to be extraordinarily valuable. But the toxic mind cannot sustain accountability. To admit they were wrong would require facing the monstrous cruelty of their own actions. Therefore, the mind performs a rapid, sinister pivot. They rewrite history in real time. Brenda set the tablet down, and her expression shifted from shock to a calculating, narrow-eyed focus. She looked at my father and then spoke into the phone. She did not express sorrow for missing my journey. Instead, she declared that this changes everything. She immediately began to spin a new narrative. She told Derek that they had always known I possessed a bright mind. She audaciously claimed that leaving me to recover on my own was a form of tough love designed to foster my independence. She actually convinced herself in that very moment that my staggering wealth was a direct result of their brilliant parenting strategy. Thomas nodded in agreement, eagerly latching onto this delusional version of the past. The fear of Derek impending bankruptcy vanished, replaced by the shimmering illusion of a massive unearned payout. They believed that because we shared a bloodline, my bank accounts were simply an extension of their own financial portfolio. The gears of manipulation began to grind with furious speed. Over the phone, the three of them started mapping out a strategy. They could not simply call and ask for cash. They knew I had ignored their generic holiday cards and maintained a strict boundary for years. They needed a grand entrance. They needed to bypass my defenses by utilizing the societal expectation of familial forgiveness. Derek suggested they find out where my corporate headquarters was located. The article mentioned the city, and a quick online search revealed the address of my executive office building. They decided a surprise visit was the best tactic. They would catch me off guard, play the role of a deeply emotional family, desperate to reconnect and corner me into a reunion. They calculated that my professional image would prevent me from causing a scene in front of my employees. Brenda began planning her wardrobe for the ambush, selecting outfits that conveyed respectable wealth and motherly warmth. Thomas rehearsed the exact phrases he would use to express his supposed pride in my accomplishments. They were treating the upcoming reunion like a high-stakes corporate heist. They were preparing to steal my peace to secure their financial rescue. They sat in their immaculate house entirely blind to the reality of the woman they were about to confront. They still thought they were dealing with the 25-year-old girl who had begged for a couch to sleep on. They did not realize that the girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had spent years forging armor out of their neglect. They were preparing to walk straight into a fortress, assuming the doors would simply swing open for them. They had no idea that I had already seen their true faces in the dark, and I was perfectly prepared to deal with them in the light. The executive boardroom on the top floor of my headquarters featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Ohio skyline. I sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, surrounded by senior legal counsel and corporate strategists. We were reviewing the final compliance clauses for the nine-figure acquisition. The atmosphere was charged with focused energy. Everyone in the room understood the gravity of the documents projected on the digital display. I was scrutinizing a specific liability clause when the heavy glass door to the suite clicked open. My executive assistant, Sarah, stepped inside. She was a seasoned professional who handled high-pressure negotiations daily, yet her face carried a rare expression of flustered panic. She walked swiftly to my chair and leaned down. She whispered that a situation had developed in the main lobby. Two individuals claiming to be my parents had bypassed the visitor checkpoint. They were currently refusing to leave the premises and were drawing a significant crowd. I excused myself from the board meeting with a steady voice, promising to return shortly. Walking toward the glass elevators, my pulse remained remarkably even. Years ago, the mere thought of confronting Brenda and Thomas would have sent a wave of paralyzing anxiety through my chest. The old version of me would have panicked, worrying about their judgment or desperate for their approval. Now I felt nothing but a cold, analytical curiosity. The elevator descended smoothly. I watched the numbers drop, reflecting on the rich irony of their timing. They had ignored my existence when I was fighting to take a single step in a plastic brace. Now they were trespassing in a building I owned. The elevator doors chimed open, revealing the expansive marble lobby of my company. The space was designed to project modern efficiency and calm authority. Standing near the reception desk were the two people who had abandoned me in a surgical recovery ward. Brenda wore a tailored beige trench coat and a silk scarf tied meticulously around her neck. It was an outfit curated specifically to project old money and maternal warmth. Thomas stood beside her, shifting his weight from side to side, wearing a forced, jovial smile. Brenda was leaning over the reception counter, speaking in a loud, theatrical tone. She was regaling the bewildered security staff with a fabricated tale about how proud they were of their daughter. She spun a story of long-lost family and sudden joyous reunions. She was playing the role of the devoted matriarch to perfection, ensuring every employee within earshot viewed her as a loving mother, simply trying to reconnect with her busy child. They were putting on a masterclass in social manipulation, using the natural human expectation of family bonds to bulldoze their way through my professional boundaries. Brenda turned and spotted me stepping out of the elevator. Her eyes widened in mock delight. She threw her arms open wide and rushed across the marble floor. Her high heels echoed sharply in the quiet space. She called out my name, her voice dripping with artificial affection. She closed the distance, aiming to pull me into a tight emotional embrace right in front of my staff. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted the audience to witness a tearful reconciliation, cementing her status as the supportive parent who had returned to celebrate her child's triumph. I did not step forward to meet her. I did not smile. I simply planted my feet and raised my right-hand palm facing outward in a universal gesture to stop. Brenda halted a mere 2 feet away. Her arms dropped awkwardly to her sides. The sweet maternal smile faltered on her lips, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. She had expected the desperate, isolated girl who used to beg for a fraction of her time. Instead, she met a woman carved from ice and steel. The lobby fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Dozens of employees stopped in their tracks watching the bizarre scene unfold. I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I searched her eyes for any trace of actual remorse, but found only hungry calculation. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone level and steeped in corporate detachment. I told her that this was a professional environment, not a stage for amateur theater. I signaled to the head of my security detail, who was standing nearby bracing for an altercation. I instructed him to escort Brenda and Thomas to conference room C on the second floor. Thomas puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim a shred of paternal authority. He tried to scold me, stating that this was no way to treat family after so many years apart. I met his gaze with unblinking resolve. I replied that if they wished to speak with me, they would wait in the designated room. If they preferred to cause a disturbance, security would escort them to the parking lot. The choice was theirs. The illusion of their dominance evaporated instantly. They realized they had walked into my domain where their usual emotional extortion held zero leverage. They were standing in the center of an empire I built, without a single drop of their help, and the realization struck them like a physical blow. Brenda quickly adjusted her silk scarf, trying to salvage her dignity. She nodded tightly, linking her arm through my father. They followed the security chief toward the stairwell, leaving a trail of whispers in their wake. I watched them ascend the steps before turning back to my assistant. I instructed Sarah to hold my calls and requested a fresh pot of black coffee sent to the second floor. I was preparing for a very specific kind of negotiation. Conference room C was the most sterile meeting space in the building. It featured barren gray walls, a frosted glass table, and rigid ergonomic chairs. It lacked any personal touches or comfortable furnishings. It was a room designed for terminating difficult contracts and dismantling hostile takeovers. I walked in 5 minutes later to find Brenda and Thomas sitting close together on one side of the glass table. They looked small and entirely out of place against the stark modern backdrop. I took the seat directly across from them. I placed my phone face down on the table and folded my hands. I did not offer them water. I did not ask about their drive or make small talk about the weather. I simply stared at them, allowing the oppressive silence of the soundproof room to stretch. I knew the rules of their game. They relied on their victims, rushing to fill uncomfortable silences with apologies and concessions. They used awkwardness as a weapon to force the other person into submission. I refused to play. The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Brenda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She opened her purse and snapped it shut again, her nervous energy betraying her composed facade. Thomas cleared his throat twice, adjusting his collar as if the room had suddenly become too warm. I sat perfectly still, projecting the immovable strength of a woman who held every single card in the deck. I finally broke the silence. I invited them to explain exactly why they had bypassed my security protocol on a Tuesday morning. I gave them the floor. I offered them the rope, knowing they would eagerly weave it into a noose of predictable, familiar lies. They were about to construct a fictional universe where they were the tragic, misunderstood heroes of my life, and I was fully prepared to let them build the entire structure before I burned it to the ground. The heavy frosted glass door clicked shut behind me, leaving the three of us isolated in the soundproof space. The air in the room felt thin and distinctly cold. Brenda stared at her manicured hands for a brief moment before launching into the performance of her life. She looked up and forced a wet sheen into her eyes. She reached across the polished table as if trying to grasp my hand, but I kept my fingers interlaced, resting them firmly on the cool glass surface. Brenda let out a trembling breath and began weaving a narrative so distorted it felt like listening to a stranger describe a movie they had barely watched. She told me that walking out of that hospital recovery ward years ago was the hardest thing she ever had to do. Her voice caught right on cue as she claimed the sight of her daughter trapped in a spinal brace broke her heart into 1,000 pieces. She spun a tale of profound parental grief, insisting that she and Thomas were so overwhelmed by the tragedy of my injury that they physically could not bear to stay in the room. It was a fascinating display of psychological gymnastics. Instead of admitting they abandoned me for a local cocktail party, they cast themselves as the ultimate victims of my medical trauma. Thomas chimed in, leaning forward to place a comforting hand over her shoulder. He spoke in deep, measured tones, trying to project the image of a protective patriarch. He told me they had spent years agonizing over the distance between us, claiming they wanted to reach out but feared causing me further distress during my rehabilitation. They painted a picture of two devoted parents suffering in the shadows while I healed. I sat there listening to the cadence of their rehearsed sorrow. I recognized the underlying rhythm immediately. It was the exact same emotional extortion tactic they used whenever Derek wrecked a car or failed a class during our childhood. They would manufacture a crisis of their own feelings to avoid taking responsibility for their cruel choices. Once Brenda felt she had established the baseline of their suffering, she executed a flawless pivot. The fake tears vanished, replaced by a bright, enthusiastic smile. She noted how proud they were of my medical supply empire. She mentioned the 9-figure acquisition headline with a casualness that betrayed the hungry gleam in her eyes. Thomas leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and suggested that true healing required collaboration. He pitched the idea of a family trust. He painted a rosy vision of us merging our assets, combining my new fortune with their supposed social influence in the Ohio business community. Thomas kept talking, spinning a web of financial jargon meant to impress me. He spoke about generational wealth and protecting family assets from taxes. He acted as though he had been a guiding force in my life, rather than a man who ignored my calls while I learned to walk again. His confidence was staggering. He truly believed that a shared last name entitled him to the harvest of a field he never helped plant. I studied the wrinkles around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. They were aging, and their financial security was crumbling. They needed a lifeline, and they had decided I was going to be their rescue boat. They were asking for the keys to the kingdom, while pretending they only wanted to sweep the front porch. Just as Thomas finished outlining his vision for our unified financial future, the conference room door swung open. The interruption was too perfectly timed to be an accident. Derek strolled into the room wearing a tailored suit that barely hid the nervous sweat staining his collar. Brenda had obviously texted him the room number while they waited in the lobby, orchestrating a united front. Derek offered a wide, charismatic grin that did not reach his eyes. He bypassed the empty chairs and stood directly behind our parents, presenting himself as the loyal, supportive brother. Derek told me he always knew my mind was built for industry. He glossed over the fact that his launch party was the reason I woke up alone and terrified. Instead, he pivoted seamlessly into a business pitch. He explained that his regional shipping franchise was poised for unprecedented expansion. Derek paced the length of the conference room trying to command the space. He smelled of cheap cologne and desperation. He pulled a glossy brochure from his jacket pocket and slid it across the glass table. It was a marketing pamphlet for his logistics company, filled with stock photos of delivery trucks and empty promises. He went on a lengthy tangent about regional shipping routes and supply chain bottlenecks, claiming his company was on the verge of dominating the Midwest corridor. I knew from industry reports that his franchise was drowning in debt and losing contracts to larger competitors. He was bleeding money and staring down bankruptcy. Yet he stood in my boardroom acting like he was offering me the deal of a lifetime. He used hollow corporate buzzwords talking about synergy and vertical integration. He suggested that my healthcare supply chain required top-tier logistics, and he was positioned to handle my national distribution. All he needed was a substantial cash injection to scale his fleet. He was essentially asking me to use the proceeds of my trauma to rescue the very business they chose over my survival. The sheer audacity required to ask your abandoned sister to fund your failing vanity project was breathtaking. I did not break eye contact with any of them. I let the silence stretch out after Derek finished his hollow presentation. I watched the three of them sitting there vibrating with greedy anticipation. A younger version of me might have felt a flare of agonizing injustice. The old Alana would have pulled out hospital records and demanded an apology for the nights she spent crying in a freezing garage. But the woman sitting at the head of that glass table felt only a cool, clinical detachment. Trying to extract genuine remorse from people who view you as an asset is like trying to draw water from a stone. I let his voice wash over me, analyzing the deep-rooted pathology of my biological family. They operated on a shared delusion where their actions carried no consequences. In their minds, my pain was irrelevant, and their needs were paramount. If I raised my voice and pointed out their hypocrisy, they would instantly cast me as the angry, irrational daughter. They would use my righteous indignation as proof that I was emotionally unstable and required their steady guidance. The only way to win a game against master manipulators is to refuse to play by their established rules. You do not argue with them. You simply give them the exact stage they desire and let their own greed orchestrate their downfall. I realized that arguing with their fabricated history would only validate their presence. It would signal that I still cared enough to fight them. Instead of offering a rebuttal, I simply nodded. I let a faint, unreadable smile touch the corners of my mouth. I told them their proposal was certainly something to consider. The visible relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. Brenda exhaled a sharp breath, and Derek noticeably relaxed his tense shoulders. They believed their coordinated ambush had worked. They thought the wealthy estranged daughter was starved enough for their validation to hand over her empire without a fight. I kept my voice smooth and professional. I informed them that my corporate team was hosting an exclusive gala this coming Friday night at a prestigious venue downtown. The event was designed to formally celebrate the acquisition and outline the future of my assets to our top investors. I looked at Brenda and told her that regional leaders and key partners would be in attendance. I suggested it would be the perfect environment to discuss legacy and future endeavors. I extended a formal invitation for the three of them to attend as my special guests. I watched the trap snap shut in real time. Thomas eagerly accepted, shaking my hand with vigorous fake warmth. Brenda promised they would be there to stand by my side exactly where a family belongs. Derek promised to bring his updated business portfolios for the reception. They walked out of the conference room, radiating triumphant energy, entirely oblivious to the reality of what they'd just agreed to. They thought they had secured a permanent seat at my table, but they were simply reserving their spots for the final act. The elevator doors slid shut, carrying Brenda, Thomas, and Derek down to the ground floor of my corporate building. Through the reinforced glass panels, I watched their descent, tracing the smug satisfaction radiating from their posture. Derek was already pulling his cell phone from his pocket, his thumb swiping frantically across the screen. He was dialing his creditors, the desperate vendors who had been hounding him for weeks over his failing shipping franchise. I could easily picture the arrogant grin on his face as he paced the sunlit Ohio pavement outside, promising them full payment by the following Monday. He told his logistics partners that his sister was bringing him on board as a primary distributor for a national medical supply network. He was selling them a phantom financial rescue banking on a check I had no intention of writing. Brenda linked her arm through my father, strutting toward their parked car, as if she owned the entire business park. She pulled out her own phone to dial the president of her local country club. For years, she had maintained a fragile grip on her social status, terrified that her peers would discover her dwindling retirement funds. Now she was securing reservations for a lavish celebratory brunch, planting the seeds of a fabricated narrative. She told whoever was on the other end of the line that her brilliant daughter was bringing the family into an exclusive healthcare partnership. She painted a picture of a tight-knit clan overcoming temporary misunderstandings to build an unstoppable legacy. They were spending phantom currency, risking their reputations, on a lie they believed had just become truth. They drove away from the headquarters buzzing with unearned triumph. They assumed my quiet nod in the conference room was a surrender. They mistook my clinical silence for obedience. People who rely on emotional extortion always interpret boundaries as temporary obstacles waiting to be pushed over. They never consider that a person might simply be standing back to let them walk into a void. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling window and walked back down the quiet corridor toward the executive boardroom. My lead estate attorney Mitchell was already sitting at the mahogany table, spreading out thick stacks of contractual documents. Mitchell was a meticulous man with decades of experience handling complex corporate acquisitions. He possessed a sharp legal mind and a fierce dedication to protecting his clients from predatory relatives. He knew the intricate details of my early recovery. He understood the long, lonely nights I spent sketching prototypes in a drafty garage while my biological family ignored my existence. He understood why I insisted on building an impenetrable wall around my assets. I took the seat across from him, picking up a sleek metal pen. We were there to execute the final stages of the 9-figure buyout, but my primary focus was the internal restructuring of that wealth. I instructed Mitchell to draft an irrevocable trust, prioritizing Joyce and David as the primary beneficiaries. They were the ones who provided a roof and unconditional support when my spine was broken. It was only right that their twilight years were insulated by the prosperity they helped foster. I also outlined the framework for a robust charitable foundation designed to provide premium rehabilitation equipment to underfunded clinics across the Midwest. Every dollar from the sale was designated, compartmentalized, and legally shielded from any external interference. Mitchell slid a specific addendum across the polished wood surface. He paused, tapping his pen against the margin. He cautioned me that contesting a will or a trust is a routine tactic for estranged relatives when extraordinary sums of money are involved. He warned me that Brenda and Thomas would likely hire ruthless counsel the moment they realized they were excluded. They would cite familial obligation and attempt to invalidate my decisions through endless, grueling litigation. They would try to paint me as an ungrateful child acting out of temporary spite. I did not flinch. I directed Mitchell to insert an explicit disinheritance clause naming my parents and my brother directly. We meticulously documented their intentional absence during my spinal surgery and their refusal to offer basic shelter during my most vulnerable medical crisis. We built a legal barricade using their own historical neglect as the mortar. The language was cold, factual, and legally binding. If they attempted to drag my estate into an Ohio courtroom, the presiding judge would be forced to read a detailed factual account of their cruelty on the public record. They would have to defend their choice to attend a minor business party while their daughter lay paralyzed in a hospital bed. I knew Brenda valued her public image above all else. The threat of public exposure would paralyze her legal efforts before they even began. Mitchell nodded, his respect evident in the quiet way he organized the files. He understood that this was not an act of fiery revenge, it was an act of surgical preservation. I was stripping away their leverage, rendering their genetic connection entirely void in the eyes of the law. I signed my name on the final signature line, the ink flowing smooth and dark against the thick parchment. The transfer of assets was officially sealed. With the legal fortress secured, I shifted my attention to the impending Friday evening gala. The corporate event planners had transformed a historic downtown venue into a spectacular stage for the acquisition announcement. Caterers were finalizing intricate menus and lighting, technicians were hanging brilliant crystal fixtures from the vaulted ceilings. The atmosphere was designed to project profound success and industry dominance. I reviewed the master guest list with my event coordinator. The roster included influential healthcare executives, local politicians, and prominent business journalists from across the region. It was the perfect audience for a monumental declaration. I focused specifically on the seating chart. I instructed the coordinator to place Brenda Thomas and Derek at a premium table directly in front of the main podium. I wanted them seated shoulder to shoulder with the most respected figures in the local business community. I was intentionally elevating their public profile, setting them under the brightest spotlight the venue had to offer. I requested that the event photographer capture their reactions, ensuring their faces were prominent in the evening documentation. The event coordinator looked puzzled, noting that I rarely highlighted my biological relatives in any corporate materials. She hesitated, asking if I wanted to reserve a moment for them to speak during the opening toasts. I simply offered a tight, polite smile and assured her that their presence in the front row was vital to the evening program. I told her they would play a pivotal role in the final presentation. They wanted a grand reunion. They craved the prestige of being associated with a highly successful entrepreneur. I was giving them exactly what they asked for. I was handing them the golden pedestal they so desperately desired. I knew that the higher they climbed, the harder the impact would be when I pulled the supporting beams away. They were going to sit in that luxurious ballroom surrounded by their peers, intoxicated by the illusion of their impending wealth. As Friday approached, I could feel the atmosphere shifting. The air crackled with the quiet hum of impending justice. My parents were busy renting designer outfits and rehearsing their roles as the supportive architects of my success. They were eagerly polishing a fictional crown, unaware that the throne they planned to sit on was constructed entirely of glass. Every phone call they made, every boastful claim they shared with their friends, only added another layer to their impending downfall. They were setting their own trap, and I was merely providing the venue. The Friday evening air carried a crisp autumn chill. As sleek town cars pulled up to the valet stand of a restored historic theater in downtown Ohio. Inside the venue, crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors and velvet drapery. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the growing crowd, carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and sparkling cider. The room buzzed with the low melodic hum of wealth and influence. Mayors, hospital board directors, and top-tier investors clustered in small dynamic groups, exchanging pleasantries and industry rumors. I stood on the mezzanine level, overlooking the reception floor, watching the intricate dance of high society unfold. Through the heavy brass doors walked Brenda Thomas and Derek. They moved with a highly choreographed swagger. Brenda wore a floor-length emerald gown that clung uncomfortably to her frame. It was clearly a high-end rental piece she had likely spent hours hunting down to match her imagined elite status. Thomas sported a tuxedo with a rigid collar that made his neck look stiff and unnatural. Derek trailed slightly behind them, adjusting his cheap cufflinks with practiced arrogance. Derek had spent his entire adulthood mimicking the posture of successful men without ever putting in the actual labor. He viewed the corporate world as a slot machine that owed him a jackpot simply for pulling the lever. Tonight, he believed the coins were finally cascading into his lap to save him from his looming bankruptcy. The trio bypassed the coat check and dove straight into the heart of the crowd. From my elevated vantage point, the view offered a clear picture of their social maneuvering. Brenda zeroed in on the chief of surgery from a prominent regional hospital. I watched her place a manicured hand over her heart, pantomiming deep maternal emotion. Even from a distance, I could read the exact shape of her fabricated story. She was telling the surgeon how she spent countless sleepless nights praying by my hospital bed. She was painting herself as the unwavering pillar of strength who guided me through the darkness of my spinal injury. She nodded solemnly, wiping a fake tear from the corner of her eye, while the surgeon offered a sympathetic smile. Derek found a group of venture capitalists standing near an elaborate ice sculpture. He handed out his glossy business cards with furious, eager speed. He leaned in close, slapping a firm hand on the shoulder of a senior investor. He was weaving a tale of sibling collaboration, claiming he provided the initial seed money to fund my garage prototype. He boasted that his logistics expertise was the secret engine driving my supply chain empire. He was selling them the illusion that any investment in his failing shipping franchise was basically a partnership with my thriving healthcare company. Thomas had intercepted a local city councilman near the bar. He laughed loudly, tossing his head back while playing the role of the jovial, proud patriarch. He was undoubtedly taking credit for my business acumen, attributing my entrepreneurial spirit to his superior genetics and rigorous parenting style. The biological trio was constructing a towering monument of deceit right in the middle of my celebration. They were laying claim to a kingdom they never defended. Every fabricated story they told to an industry leader was another brick added to their pedestal. They were ensuring that every influential person in that room knew exactly who they were and what they supposedly contributed to my journey. They were tying their reputations to a ship they believed was sailing toward a golden shore. Just a few feet away from me on the mezzanine stood Joyce and David. They looked genuinely out of place amidst the glitz and glamour of the corporate elite. David wore a simple gray suit he had owned for a decade, and Joyce had chosen a modest navy dress. They were not mingling or handing out cards to secure favors. They were not leveraging my success to boost their own social standing. They were simply holding hands and looking out over the crowd with quiet, profound pride. When David caught my eye, he offered a small, encouraging nod. Joyce smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. They required no audience to validate their worth. They knew the truth of those freezing nights in the garage and the agonizing mornings of physical therapy. They held the quiet confidence of people who had done the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do. I looked back down at the main floor. Brenda was now introducing Thomas to a group of hospital administrators. They were laughing and clinking glasses. It is a strange phenomenon to watch people who destroyed your early life try to wear your victory like a stolen coat. They possess a terrifying capacity to compartmentalize their cruelty. In their minds, the night they left me immobilized to attend a trivial launch party no longer existed. They had replaced that memory with a fictionalized montage, where they were the loving heroes of my triumphant return. I felt a cold, steady rhythm settling into my chest. I watched them build their fraudulent public image higher and higher. They were setting themselves up on a massive stage, utterly blind to the fact that the floorboards were designed to collapse. I wanted them to secure the attention of every major player in the room. I needed the audience to see their arrogant posturing so the impending fall would be impossible to misinterpret. My event coordinator walked up the stairs and approached my side. She held a clipboard and a wireless earpiece. She quietly informed me that the initial reception hour was concluding and the guests were ready for the formal presentation. She asked if my parents were prepared for their reserved seating. I told her they were exactly where they needed to be. Down below, the string quartet softly ended their set. The ambient lighting in the reception hall dimmed, signaling the beginning of the main event. A hush fell over the room as attendees began moving through the arched doorways toward the grand ballroom where the stage was illuminated. Brenda, Thomas, and Derek walked to the front row with a noticeable strut. They found the plush chairs adorned with reserved placards bearing their names. They smoothed their rented clothes and sat down, vibrating with hungry expectation. Brenda whispered something to Thomas, pointing toward the podium. Derek crossed his legs, projecting an air of supreme confidence. They were ready for their public coronation. They expected to hear their names called over the sound system, followed by an outpouring of gratitude and a symbolic passing of the torch. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket and began walking down the curved staircase toward the ballroom. The chatter of the crowd faded into a respectful silence as I approached the stage steps. The spotlight focused on the center microphone. The faces in the audience turned toward me, waiting for the traditional corporate speech about innovation and market synergy. I stepped onto the platform, looking directly down at the three people sitting in the front row. They smiled up at me, their eyes wide with anticipation, unaware that the story I was about to tell would strip away everything they valued in front of the entire world. The glare of the stage lights hit my face, carrying a heavy warmth that contrasted sharply with the icy calm settling deep inside my chest. I stood behind the polished acrylic podium, looking out over a sea of hundreds of expectant faces. The grand ballroom of the historic venue was completely silent, save for the faint clinking of crystal glasses near the back bars. I gripped the smooth edges of the podium, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Down in the front row, Brenda, Thomas, and Derek were practically glowing with predatory anticipation. My mother sat with her spine rigid, her chin tilted upward, arranging her features into a mask of benevolent maternal pride. She kept glancing at the prominent hospital executives seated to her left, ensuring they were observing her close proximity to the guest of honor. My father had his hands folded neatly in his lap, projecting the image of a seasoned patriarch waiting for his inevitable public validation. Derek was leaning forward, almost vibrating in his rented tuxedo, dreaming of the massive financial rescue he believed was only moments away. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed across the expansive, historic venue, crisp and perfectly steady. I began by formally acknowledging the executives from the national health conglomerate sitting in the second row. I announced the finalized acquisition of my medical supply company, confirming the nine-figure valuation that had been dominating the regional business journals all week. I spoke about the incredible dedication of my manufacturing team and the sheer scale of our new distribution contracts. As the astronomical purchase price of $115 million rang through the speaker system, the entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. I watched the front row carefully as the crowd cheered. Brenda actually raised her hand to her chest, letting out a soft, fabricated gasp of joy. Thomas nodded approvingly, patting Derek on the back. They were soaking in the applause, absorbing the validation of the surrounding elite, as if the ovation belonged entirely to them. They were ready for their names to be called. They fully expected me to gesture toward their seats and deliver a tearful speech attributing my relentless drive and entrepreneurial success to their unwavering family support. They had spent the entire cocktail hour building a towering, fraudulent narrative, and they believed I was about to place the final golden brick on top of it. I raised my hand, asking the audience to settle down. The applause slowly faded away, leaving a dense, expectant quiet hanging in the air. I let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, watching the confident smile begin to strain at the corners of her mouth. I spoke softly, but the microphone caught every syllable. I told the gathered crowd that every successful company is built upon a foundational origin story. I noted that most people naturally assumed my ergonomic designs were born in a prestigious university laboratory or funded by a massive corporate research grant. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the rows of influential politicians and wealthy investors. Then I lowered my voice, stripping away all the corporate polish. I told them the truth. I explained that my company was born in the darkest corner of a sterile surgical recovery ward. I described waking up on a Tuesday evening with titanium hardware freshly drilled into my shattered vertebrae. I painted a vivid picture of the paralyzing terror that gripped my chest when I realized I could not move my legs. I told the audience about reaching for the call button with trembling fingers, praying desperately for a familiar face to guide me through the suffocating haze of anesthesia. A heavy, uncomfortable stillness began to ripple through the venue. The prominent executives shifted in their seats, sensing a drastic departure from the usual celebratory corporate rhetoric. Down in the front row, the smug satisfaction on my parents' faces abruptly vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying confusion. Brenda gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning stark white. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to display any trace of sorrow. I informed the hundreds of guests that when I opened my eyes in that hospital room, I found only empty chairs. I gestured directly toward the front row, pointing my finger at the three people sitting under the bright stage lights. I stated clearly and unequivocally that my biological parents, along with my brother, made a deliberate choice that evening. I told the crowd that they chose to leave their immobilized daughter alone in a trauma unit so they could attend a trivial business mixer across town. The oxygen instantly vanished from the massive ballroom. An audible collective gasp rippled through the crowd of hundreds. I did not stop. I detailed how they abandoned me to face a mountain of catastrophic medical debt simply because dealing with my physical tragedy was entirely too inconvenient for their curated social calendar. I explained how they refused to offer me a place to sleep, determining that my broken body was a bad investment that would drag down their precious upper-middle-class facade. I told the room that the brilliant medical devices we were celebrating tonight were sketched on cheap notepad paper while I was terrified, starving, and facing complete financial ruin. The social execution was absolute. Hundreds of eyes slowly panned away from the stage and focused entirely on the front row. The wealthy investors, the hospital board directors, and the local politicians whom Brenda had been aggressively courting just an hour ago were now staring at her with undisguised horror and profound disgust. The physical collapse of their fabricated reality was devastating to witness. The emerald gown Brenda had rented suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating trap. Her mouth opened and closed silently, unable to form a single word of defense against the crushing weight of public exposure. The carefully constructed mask of the loving matriarch dissolved completely, leaving behind the terrified, fragile ego of a woman whose greatest nightmare had just materialized. Thomas shrank down in his seat, his face draining of all color. He looked utterly pathetic, stripped of his patriarchal authority in front of the very men he had been trying to impress. Derek sat frozen, staring blankly at his polished shoes. His hollow dreams of securing a massive corporate distribution contract evaporated into thin air as the true nature of his character was broadcast to the entire business community. They had walked into my venue, believing they could leverage societal expectations to force a reunion. They had assumed my desire for a respectable public image would prevent me from airing dirty laundry. They grossly underestimated the woman standing at the podium. I had no dirty laundry to hide because the shame belonged entirely to them. I shifted my gaze away from their panicking faces and looked up toward the mezzanine level. I pointed toward the balcony where Joyce and David were standing together in the shadows. I introduced them to the stunned crowd. I explained that true family is not defined by a shared bloodline or a legal obligation. I told the audience that true family is defined by the people who provide a safe harbor when the storm is at its worst. I announced that a significant portion of the acquisition funds had already been placed into an irrevocable trust to ensure that the two strangers who saved my life would live out their days in absolute paradise. I turned back to the microphone, delivering the final devastating blow to the front row. I announced the creation of a massive charitable foundation designed to fully fund rehabilitation equipment for low-income patients across the state. I stated that every single asset, every patent, and every dollar from the sale had been meticulously structured and legally locked away. I looked directly at Derek, noting that not a single cent would ever be available for external business ventures or familial loans. The message was crystal clear. They had attended this gala to claim a fortune, but they were leaving with nothing but total public humiliation. The business leaders seated around them began leaning away, creating a physical barrier of revulsion. The silence in the room was deafening, signaling the complete and permanent destruction of their social standing. I stood at the podium watching the fallout unfold, knowing the real chaos was only just beginning. I kept my gaze locked on the upper balcony as the heavy silence in the ballroom reached a breaking point. The spotlight operator, understanding the gravity of the moment, smoothly shifted the brilliant beam of white light away from the stage and directed it upward into the shadows. The illumination found Joyce and David standing near the velvet railing. They looked entirely stunned, blinking against the sudden blinding brightness. I leaned closer to the microphone, and my voice carried a profound warmth that had been entirely absent when I addressed the front row. I asked the two people who had saved my life to please come down and join me on the platform. The entire venue turned in unison to watch them. David placed a gentle, protective hand on the small of his wife back, guiding her toward the grand curving staircase. They moved slowly, exhibiting the humble grace of individuals who had spent their entire lives working hard without ever asking for a single moment of public recognition. David was still wearing his simple gray suit, the one he saved for church Sundays, and Joyce smoothed the fabric of her understated navy dress. As they reached the main floor, an incredible phenomenon occurred. The wealthy investors, the influential local politicians, and the top-tier medical executives naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path for them to walk through. The corporate elite recognized genuine nobility when they saw it, and they yielded the floor with deep, unspoken respect. They walked right past the front row. They stepped within inches of Brenda Thomas and Derek. The visual contrast was a masterpiece of absolute poetic justice. My biological family sat frozen in their rented high-end formal wear, reeking of superficial desperation and sudden catastrophic failure. Joyce and David walked past them, radiating an authentic, quiet dignity that no amount of stolen wealth could ever purchase. I stepped forward to the edge of the stage and reached out, grasping their calloused hands to help them up the final few stairs. I brought them to the center of the stage, flanking the clear acrylic podium. I looked out at the massive audience and stated that a company focused on healing human trauma must be guided by individuals who actually understand the meaning of deep, unselfish compassion. I declared that without the intervention of the two individuals standing beside me, the ergonomic medical devices saving patients across the country would simply not exist. I told the captivated crowd about the bitter Ohio winter we spent in a freezing detached garage, utilizing scrap metal and extreme determination, because these two strangers refused to let a broken young woman succumb to despair. I made sure every person in that room understood exactly who had done the heavy lifting when my body was shattered. Then I delivered the financial reality that would seal my biological family fate permanently. I announced that the entire proceeds from the $115 million corporate buyout had been irrevocably restructured. I declared that Joyce and David were officially named as the primary lifelong beneficiaries of the wealth generated by the sale. Furthermore, I informed the press and the gathered medical community that this incredible couple would sit as the leading board members of my newly established charitable foundation, directing millions of dollars toward underfunded rehabilitation clinics across the nation. The reaction from the audience was instantaneous and earth-shattering. The ballroom did not just applaud politely. The guests erupted into a deafening, roaring, standing ovation. Hundreds of people rose to their feet, cheering with a fierce, genuine enthusiasm that physically shook the heavy crystal fixtures hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The sound was a tangible force, a massive tidal wave of validation washing over the stage. David, the stoic factory worker who had spent 40 years measuring manufacturing tolerances without shedding a single tear, broke down completely. Tears streamed freely down his weathered face as he wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a crushing, desperate embrace. Joyce buried her face in her hands, weeping with a profound, soul-shaking gratitude. She held onto my shoulder, whispering her disbelief, her knees trembling under the weight of a financial reward she never once sought or expected. While the stage was bathed in tears of joy and thunderous respect, the front row had descended into an agonizing, silent hell. I looked down at Brenda Thomas and Derek over the shoulder of my true father. They were entirely paralyzed. The horrifying reality of the situation had finally penetrated their thick layers of narcissistic delusion. They were not going to receive a single dime. There would be no sprawling mansions, no luxury vacations, and no corporate bailouts to erase their mistakes. Their lifelong campaign of manipulation, cruelty, and arrogant entitlement had yielded an absolute zero balance. Derek looked as though the oxygen had been vacuumed directly from his lungs. His hands gripped his knees, his knuckles stark white and rigid. During the earlier cocktail hour, he had aggressively pitched his failing shipping franchise to multiple venture capitalists, using my name as unearned collateral. He had promised them massive returns, claiming he was the primary distributor for my healthcare network. Now those very same investors were standing just a few yards away, clapping for the true architects of my success, while glaring at Derek with intense, predatory realization. They knew he was a massive fraud. The phantom safety net he had woven out of my accomplishments had just evaporated, dropping him straight into a terrifying financial abyss. Brenda sat rigidly, her face resembling a cracked porcelain mask. The high society friends and country club executives she had spent the evening courting were now looking down at her with undisguised contempt. In the ruthless logic of American high society, there is no greater sin than being exposed as a destitute, manipulative liar. Her entire social standing, the very currency she valued above her own flesh and blood, was incinerated in a matter of seconds. She could not spin this horrific outcome. She could not construct a new narrative to explain why her wealthy daughter had just publicly crowned two ordinary strangers as her rightful heirs, while leaving her biological mother to rot in the audience. Thomas was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his stiff, rented tuxedo shirt. The patriarchal authority he had always weaponized against me was shattered beyond repair. He was exposed as a coward, a man who walked away from his paralyzed child to attend a cocktail mixer. He stared at the stage, his eyes wide and vacant, realizing that his legacy was nothing more than a public cautionary tale of monumental greed. The intense applause slowly began to recede, transitioning into a vibrant, excited murmur as the formal presentation concluded. I guided Joyce and David down the side stairs of the platform, surrounded immediately by a protective detail of security personnel and eager journalists wanting to hear their miraculous story. The gala transitioned into a dynamic networking reception, but the atmosphere in the front of the room turned instantly volatile. As my security team created a secure perimeter around my chosen family, a violent commotion erupted near the front row seating. Derek, unable to handle the crushing weight of his impending ruin, completely snapped. He leaped out of his chair, knocking it backward with a loud clatter onto the polished marble floor. Several angry investors who had been waiting for the presentation to end, aggressively, blocked his path toward the main exit. A tall, imposing venture capitalist grabbed Derek by the shoulder of his suit jacket, loudly demanding an immediate return of the bridge loan he had just secured, based on his fraudulent claims of a corporate partnership. Derek swung his arms wildly, trying to push his way through the tightening circle of furious creditors. Brenda, witnessing her golden son being cornered and her own social standing completely destroyed, lost her remaining grip on sanity. She lunged forward, shoving past a prominent hospital director, and made a desperate manic grab for a nearby press microphone resting on a media table. She began screaming wildly into the unamplified device, claiming that I was mentally unstable and that Joyce and David had kidnapped and brainwashed me during my medical crisis. Her shrill, unhinged voice echoed over the sophisticated jazz music, cutting through the elegant ambiance like a rusty saw blade. She pointed a trembling finger at the stage, threatening to call the federal authorities, demanding an immediate psychiatric hold on her own daughter. She shrieked that she was hiring the most ruthless litigation team in the state, vowing to legally dismantle the entire corporate acquisition before Monday morning. The sheer chaos of her outburst triggered a massive, rapid response from the venue security detail. They were no longer just a public embarrassment. My biological family had become an active, violent threat to the finalization of a $100 million transaction, and I watched with absolute cold precision as the trap I built finally closed its heavy steel jaws around them. The massive ballroom descended into an eerie, unnatural hush as the sheer gravity of my announcement settled over the crowd. The thunderous applause that had just celebrated Joyce and David dissolved into a thick, heavy silence. My biological family stood frozen in the front row of the historic venue. Their perfectly curated masks of affluent superiority had melted away entirely, leaving behind expressions of pure, unadulterated panic. They had spent the entire evening weaving a fraudulent public image of unconditional love, expecting a massive financial windfall to validate their lies. Now the terrible reality of their absolute exclusion hung over them like a dark storm cloud. Then Brenda snapped. The sudden horrifying realization that her anticipated millions were completely out of reach broke whatever fragile restraint she had left. She pushed past a prominent city councilman and stepped forcefully into the open aisle, separating the stage from the seating area. Her rented emerald gown dragged heavily against the polished marble floor. The carefully constructed facade of the devoted, loving matriarch shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at the stage. Her voice, usually modulated for polite country club gossip, tore from her throat in a shrill, grating shriek. She called me an ungrateful and spiteful child. She screamed that a daughter owed her mother everything and that real family deserved their rightful share of the newly acquired wealth. She listed entirely fabricated sacrifices, claiming she had given up the best years of her life to raise me only to be publicly humiliated in front of her peers. She demanded that I reverse the trust documents immediately and honor my biological obligations. Derek, emboldened by our mother's unhinged outburst, surged forward to join her in the aisle. The venture capitalists who had been cornering him just moments prior now watched him with expressions of cold, clinical disgust. Derek was sweating profusely, his cheap rented tuxedo clinging to his broad shoulders. He began yelling frantically about bloodlines and strict legal rights. He shouted that he would hire the most aggressive corporate litigators in the entire state of Ohio. He threatened to drag my new charitable foundation into endless court battles until I handed over the capital he desperately needed to save his failing logistics franchise. He demanded his cut of the $115 million acquisition as if my relentless labor and physical agony were merely an investment portfolio he was entitled to manage. Thomas remained near his reserved seat, watching the chaotic spectacle unfold with wide, terrified eyes. He made a weak, pathetic motion to grab Brenda by the arm, trying to pull her back into the shadows. He possessed just enough social awareness to recognize the absolute devastation of their reputation happening in real time. But Brenda shoved his hand away, completely consumed by her greedy rage. It is a remarkable psychological phenomenon to witness toxic manipulators completely lose control when their primary source of leverage is abruptly removed. They operate under the deeply flawed delusion that their victims are permanent extensions of their own ego, meant only to serve their desires. When a victim finally severs the cord and claims their own power, the abuser does not feel remorse or seek genuine understanding. They feel robbed of property they never truly owned. They react with the vicious indignation of a thief who discovers the vault they plan to empty has already been sealed shut. Society often pressures victims of family trauma to forgive and forget, urging them to prioritize blood relations above personal peace. However, true healing often requires standing firmly in the light and allowing those toxic individuals to expose their own monstrous greed to the world. The venue security details surged forward from the perimeter, their radios buzzing, as they moved to intercept the violent disturbance. I raised my hand in a swift, silent command. The guards paused, maintaining a strict protective barrier around the stage, but allowing the confrontation to play out. I did not want Brenda and Derek dragged out of the room kicking and screaming before I delivered my final verdict. I wanted the entire assembly of hospital directors, politicians, and potential investors to witness the unfiltered toxic reality of my biological relatives. I wanted the crowd to see exactly why I had legally fortified my empire against them. I leaned closer to the acrylic podium, gripping the smooth edges with steady hands. The microphone amplified my voice, pushing it clearly and dominantly over Brenda's frantic shrieks. I did not raise my pitch or match their desperate, chaotic energy. I spoke with an absolute chilling calm that immediately commanded the attention of every single person in the grand ballroom. I looked down at the screaming woman who had abandoned me and the brother who was trying to steal from me, and I delivered the truth that would end their reign over my life forever. I stated clearly that the concept of family is a profound responsibility, not a financial transaction to be cashed in when convenient. I let my words resonate across the vast space, echoing off the hanging crystal chandeliers. I told them that family is defined entirely by who shows up in the dark, terrifying moments of life. Family represents the people who stand by your hospital bed when your spine is shattered and your future is a terrifying void. Family is not the people who abandon you to attend a trivial cocktail mixer and then arrive at the finish line expecting a payout after someone else ran the entire grueling marathon. I shifted my gaze directly into Derek's panicked, sweating face. I told him that shared bloodlines do not grant a person unrestricted access to the fruits of another person's grueling labor. I publicly dismissed his empty legal threats, reminding him that my estate was legally fortified by the sharpest legal minds in the corporate sector. I advised him to stop shouting at me and spend his remaining energy figuring out how to explain his fraudulent business practices to the very angry investors standing right behind him. I watched the color drain from his face as the reality of his impending bankruptcy finally crushed his arrogant spirit. I looked back at Brenda. Her mouth was still open, but my cold, unwavering dismissal had finally silenced her screams. I told her that she could no longer manipulate her way into my fortune because there was no lingering love or guilt left for her to exploit. I publicly dismissed their pathetic demands, exposing their naked, consuming greed to the hundreds of silent, judging witnesses surrounding them. I told them they held no power here, and they would never receive a single cent of my hard-earned wealth. The humiliation was absolute and entirely irreversible. The high society crowd that Brenda had spent her entire evening trying to charm physically turned their backs on her. Prominent hospital executives and wealthy philanthropists whispered quietly to one another, casting glances of pure revulsion toward the trio in the aisle. The social capital my parents valued above my own life was incinerated in a matter of minutes. The influential people they idolized now viewed them as destitute, deceitful outcasts. They stood there under the glaring stage lights, totally paralyzed by the horrifying realization of their complete failure. They had walked into the corporate gala believing they held the ultimate power of parental authority, ready to claim a massive fortune. They realized far too late that their authority was nothing more than a brittle illusion. They had lost the staggering financial windfall they had so eagerly anticipated. More devastatingly, they had lost their carefully curated reputation in a single swift public blow. They were entirely ruined in the very community they desperately wanted to rule. Thomas finally stepped forward and grabbed Brenda by the elbow, pulling her forcefully toward the main exit. She stumbled in her expensive rented heels, her face a pale mask of profound shock and deep, bitter shame. Derek followed closely behind them, keeping his head down to avoid making eye contact with his furious creditors, who were already whispering into their cell phones. The massive crowd parted silently, allowing them to leave not out of respect, but out of a deep, overwhelming desire to be rid of their toxic presence. As the heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them, the stifling tension in the room instantly lifted. The toxic weight they carried had been completely excised from my world. I turned away from the exit and looked back at Joyce and David, who were still standing securely by my side, wiping tears of joy from their faces. The storm had finally passed, and the fortress I had built was entirely secure, ready for whatever beautiful chapter came next. The uniformed security team moved with a quiet efficiency that was far more intimidating than any display of brute force. 6 guards formed a seamless human barricade around Brenda, Thomas, and Derek. They did not shout or grab collars or create an undignified scuffle. They simply advanced with an unrelenting synchronized step that forced my biological family backward toward the grand exit of the ballroom. The silence in the venue was absolute. Hundreds of the most influential people in Ohio watched this slow march of total disgrace. Brenda kept her face angled toward the floor, her previous shrieks completely extinguished by the sheer crushing weight of public humiliation. Thomas tried to maintain a fraction of his patriarchal dignity by straightening his rented tuxedo jacket, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. Derek walked slightly ahead of them, his shoulders slumped, looking like a man walking toward a firing squad. As the heavy brass doors of the venue clicked shut behind them, the chilly autumn wind hit their faces. They were standing on the sidewalk outside the historic theater while the golden light from the ballroom spilled onto the pavement. The valet attendants stared at them, sensing the chaotic, toxic energy of their sudden departure. This is the exact moment when the illusion of arrogant entitlement shatters against the concrete wall of reality. Individuals who navigate life through manipulation and deceit often operate under the false assumption that their charm can override any consequence. They believe that apologies are just magical incantations used to reset the board when their cruelty is exposed to the light. But the universe operates on a system of strict balance. When you abandon a wounded child in a surgical ward and then attempt to steal her fortune years later, the resulting punishment is not merely financial. It is a profound spiritual and social exile. Derek leaned against a brick pillar near the valet stand, pulling out his cell phone. The screen displayed dozens of missed calls from the furious venture capitalists who had remained inside the gala. His logistics franchise was already teetering on the edge of the abyss, and he had just used my name as a fraudulent bridge to secure phantom capital. Without that cash injection, his business was completely doomed. He looked at Brenda and Thomas, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The massive fortune they had mentally spent during the cocktail hour was entirely gone. In the weeks that followed the corporate gala, the devastating aftermath of their greed unfolded with a surgical precision. Derek Logistics' business officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy less than a month later. The shipping contracts he had desperately tried to salvage were terminated by vendors who had read the industry reports detailing his public meltdown at the charity event. The bank moved swiftly, seizing his remaining assets and locking the heavy steel doors to his distribution warehouse. He was forced to vacate his expensive leased apartment, moving into a cramped weekly rental on the outskirts of the city. His grand vision of dominating the Midwest supply chain evaporated, leaving him with nothing but a ruined credit score and an unhirable reputation. Brenda and Thomas faced an entirely different kind of destruction. Their immediate reaction to the gala was pure indignant rage. They convinced themselves that my irrevocable trust could be dismantled by a clever, ambitious attorney. They believed that a local court of law would inherently favor biological parents and overturn my meticulous financial structuring. They spent weeks driving to the most prestigious law firms in the state, carrying thick folders filled with their absurd legal demands. They sat in pristine legal offices pitching their case to high-priced litigators. They spun their familiar narrative of parental devotion and claimed I was suffering from emotional distress when I signed the corporate documents. However, every single lawyer reviewed the paperwork prepared by my estate team and delivered the exact same verdict. The legal structure I had implemented was absolutely flawless. The disinheritance clauses were ironclad, citing specific documented dates of their medical neglect and financial abandonment. The charitable foundation and the trust designated for Joyce and David were barricaded behind impenetrable layers of protective corporate shielding. The attorneys actually laughed them out of their offices, explaining that challenging the documents would only result in astronomical legal fees and zero chance of victory. The justice system has very little patience for estranged relatives who attempt to bypass legally sound trusts simply because they feel entitled to a payout. The law recognizes the autonomy of a successful entrepreneur to designate her wealth exactly as she sees fit. My biological parents learned the hard way that bloodlines do not supersede binding corporate contracts. The realization that they possessed absolutely zero legal ground to claim a single cent of the $115 million sale finally broke their spirits. They returned to their quiet suburban house, burdened by a new and deeply humiliating reality. The credit card bills began to arrive in their mailbox, compounding their misery. They had financed their trip to the gala using high-interest credit cards, paying exorbitant rental fees for the emerald gown and the tailored tuxedo they wore. They had spent money they did not have to project an image of extreme wealth they did not possess. Now they were drowning in severe consumer debt with no magical bailout on the horizon. The financial ruin was severe, but the social isolation was the true execution. Brenda had spent decades cultivating a delicate position within the local country club hierarchy. She thrived on neighborhood gossip and the perceived envy of her peers. But the corporate elites who attended my charity gala lived in those exact same affluent Ohio neighborhoods. Word of their monstrous behavior spread through the community like a fast-moving wildfire. It is fascinating to observe how quickly high society will close its ranks when a member is exposed as a toxic liability. Wealthy communities will often tolerate arrogance and minor indiscretions, but they will fiercely reject anyone who brings a massive public scandal to their doorstep. The women who used to invite Brenda to afternoon luncheons suddenly stopped answering her phone calls. The couples who normally joined Thomas for weekend golf outings found convenient excuses to cancel their tea times. When Brenda walked through the aisles of the local premium grocery store, she noticed her former friends turning down different aisles to avoid making eye contact. The judgmental whispers followed her everywhere she went. She was no longer the respected matriarch of a successful business family. She was the cruel woman who had abandoned her paralyzed daughter and then tried to steal her medical empire. Their entire social circle completely abandoned them, leaving them trapped in a large house filled with deafening silence. They had spent their entire lives treating people as disposable commodities, valuing superficial status over genuine human connection. The ultimate and permanent consequence of their lifelong cruelty was that they were finally left with nothing but each other. They were forced to sit across from one another at their polished dining room table, staring at a stack of mounting bills, with no one left to manipulate and no one left to blame. They had built a prison of their own design and locked themselves inside. As I watched their slow demise from the comfortable distance of my private estate, I felt absolutely no pity. My focus was entirely dedicated to the massive charitable foundation I was building alongside Joyce and David. We were channeling millions of dollars into purchasing premium recovery equipment for rural physical therapy centers. We were actively changing the landscape of medical rehabilitation for the patients who desperately needed our support. The dark shadow of my biological family had been permanently excised from my world, allowing the bright light of genuine purpose to shine through completely unobstructed. The seasons changed across the sprawling Ohio estate, bringing a vibrant burst of brilliant colors that mirrored the profound renewal taking place within my own life. The heavy, oppressive storm clouds that had hovered over me for 25 years were finally gone, completely replaced by clear skies and limitless possibility. I walked out onto the wide stone porch of our home, breathing in the crisp morning air, with a set of lungs that no longer felt restricted by anxiety or physical pain. My morning routine had evolved dramatically from those agonizing physical therapy sessions in a freezing suburban garage to reviewing massive philanthropic grants over a cup of fresh, dark roast coffee. The medical supply company was operating flawlessly under the guidance of the health conglomerate, but my true daily passion was now entirely focused on the charitable foundation. I sat at a large mahogany table on the patio, watching David walk toward his custom-built woodshop near the edge of the private pond. He moved with a relaxed, steady stride, completely unburdened by the financial stress that used to weigh down his broad shoulders. He spent his days crafting beautiful, intricate birdhouses and restoring antique furniture simply because it brought him genuine joy. A few yards away, Joyce was tending to an expansive, vibrant garden. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and thick gardening gloves, humming a quiet melody as she pruned the blooming rose bushes. I watched them both with a deep, swelling sense of gratitude that defied simple words. They were the absolute strangers who had caught me when I was plummeting toward absolute rock bottom. They had asked for absolutely nothing in return, expecting only that I try my hardest to heal. Providing them with a sanctuary where they could spend their golden years wrapped in comfort and absolute security was the greatest achievement of my entire existence. Together, the three of us managed the daily operations of the foundation. Our mission was crystal clear and deeply personal. We identified rural rehabilitation clinics and underfunded physical therapy centers across the Midwest, providing them with state-of-the-art, ergonomic recovery gear completely free of charge. We focused specifically on vulnerable patients who were drowning in the exact same medical debt that had nearly destroyed my life years ago. I personally reviewed the application files, reading heartbreaking stories of factory workers who had suffered catastrophic workplace accidents and young athletes whose dreams were derailed by sudden spinal injuries. Every time we approved a grant and shipped a pallet of high-density polymer back braces to a struggling clinic, I felt a profound sense of spiritual healing. The trauma I had endured in that lonely hospital room was no longer just a source of bitter pain. It had been transformed into a powerful catalyst for widespread genuine good. I was taking the darkest chapter of my history and using it to write brighter futures for hundreds of vulnerable people. During this entire period of immense personal and professional growth, the silence from my biological family remained absolute. I never received another hollow holiday card or a desperate pleading phone call. The ironclad legal boundaries I had established, combined with the spectacular public humiliation they suffered at the corporate gala, had effectively permanently banished them from my universe. I did not spend a single moment wondering about Derek and his bankrupt logistics franchise. I did not care if Brenda and Thomas were struggling to maintain their crumbling social status or paying off the massive consumer debt they had accrued renting designer clothes for an event that ruined them. Society frequently conditions victims of toxic family abuse to feel an inherent sense of guilt for walking away. We are constantly fed the false narrative that blood relations require infinite forgiveness, regardless of the severe cruelty inflicted upon us. But as I sat on my peaceful Ohio porch, I felt absolutely zero guilt. I felt only a pure, unadulterated liberation. They had shown me exactly who they were when they left me paralyzed and starving, choosing a trivial networking event over my survival. They had viewed my broken body as a worthless liability and only attempted to reclaim me when I became a highly lucrative asset. Severing ties with individuals who operate on such a monstrous level of transactional greed is not an act of malice. It is an act of profound vital self-respect. Looking back on the incredible trajectory of my journey, the stark contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. I had started as a discarded, terrified daughter, encased in a rigid plastic shell, wondering how I would survive the week. Now I was a powerful, independent woman, dictating the terms of my own reality and actively shaping the medical industry. The entire experience reinforced a core fundamental American ideal. You do not inherit your place at the table simply because you share a genetic link or loudly demand unearned respect. You build your own table through relentless hard work, undeniable loyalty, and the quiet, gritty determination to survive when the odds are entirely stacked against you. The monetary wealth I had accumulated was staggering, but the true fortune was the family I had actively chosen. Joyce and David taught me that love is an action verb. It is measured in the grueling hours spent sanding thermoplastic molds in a freezing garage, and the steady hands that hold you upright when your legs completely refuse to work. They proved that genuine compassion does not require a large audience, and true support does not come with a hidden invoice. The fierce anger and the sharp betrayal that used to burn like hot coals in my chest had been completely extinguished. I no longer harbored any lingering desire to confront my biological parents or seek a hollow apology from my brother. The ultimate realization washed over me, bringing a profound and unshakable sense of inner peace. I finally understood that the greatest, most devastating revenge you can ever inflict upon toxic manipulators does not involve screaming matches or bitter legal battles. The ultimate victory is simply walking away and building a spectacularly beautiful life that they are never allowed to touch. If you have ever found yourself standing in the dark wondering how to rebuild your life after being broken by the people who were supposed to protect you, please know that your unique story is far from over. The trauma you endured does not define your final destination. It can easily become the very solid foundation upon which you construct an unstoppable empire. This incredible journey reminds us all that true wealth is never defined by the balance in a bank account, but by the depth of loyalty we share with the people who stand by us during our darkest hours. We often spend years chasing the approval of toxic individuals, believing we must earn their love through constant painful sacrifice. But real love does not require a transaction, and true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than unearned entitlement. Alana proved that you can take the most painful betrayal imaginable and channel that exact energy into building a life of profound purpose and extraordinary success. She demonstrated that you never have to settle for the broken narrative others try to force upon you. You have the absolute power to pick up the pen and write a triumphant conclusion on your own terms. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this incredible story of resilience and ultimate justice. If you found inspiration in Alana and her chosen family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Senior Echo Stories. We have an entire playlist of gripping emotional journeys waiting for you right here on the screen. Please share this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own strength today. I wish you all a wonderful week filled with peace, genuine connection, and the courage to build your own beautiful reality. The end. The morning sun rises over the quiet Ohio Valley, casting a warm golden light across the surface of our private pond. I sit on the stone patio, holding a mug of dark roast coffee, watching David meticulously sand a piece of reclaimed mahogany near his workshop. A few yards away, Joyce is kneeling in the vibrant garden soil, humming a gentle melody while she tends to the blooming hydrangeas. This serene landscape is a million miles away from the sterile freezing garage where my journey began. It is a profound daily reminder of the extraordinary life we have built together. Looking back on the jagged road that led me to this peaceful sanctuary, I realize that the universe often breaks us down simply to clear the foundation for something infinitely better. I have spent a great deal of time reflecting on the chaotic collision between my biological past and my chosen future. I want to share the 5 essential truths that this entire agonizing and beautiful experience has cemented into my soul. The first lesson is perhaps the most difficult to accept, but the most liberating to understand. Biology is merely a genetic coincidence, not a binding contract. True family is not determined by the people who share your last name or demand your unearned loyalty. True family is defined exclusively by the people who walk into the dark room when everyone else has turned their backs and walked away. The second truth involves the actual definition of wealth. We are conditioned to believe that success is measured by 9-figure acquisitions and expansive corporate headquarters. I learned that genuine wealth is the quiet, unshakable peace of mind you feel when you finally sever ties with toxic manipulation. It is the ability to breathe without bracing for the next emotional blow. This leads directly into the third lesson regarding the concept of retribution. Society loves a fiery, dramatic confrontation where the victim screams at their abusers and demands a hollow apology. I discovered that the absolute greatest revenge you can ever achieve is massive silent success. You do not need to fight your abusers in the mud. You simply need to build a spectacular life that they are never allowed to touch. The fourth reality I embraced is the critical necessity of ironclad boundaries. Toxic individuals rely entirely on your guilt and your lingering hope for closure to maintain their control. When you remove their access, you remove their power. Establishing rigid, non-negotiable boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the most fundamental act of self-preservation a person can take. The fifth and final lesson is about the remarkable alchemy of human resilience. The deepest trauma you experience does not have to remain a permanent open wound. It can be weaponized. You can channel the agonizing pain of betrayal and abandonment into a relentless driving force. The very tragedy that was meant to destroy you can become the solid bedrock of an unstoppable empire. I share these truths hoping they reach anyone sitting in the dark, wondering if they have the strength to stand back up. Your story is not over simply because the people who were supposed to protect you decided to walk away. You have the ultimate power to write a triumphant ending on your entirely own terms. Thank you so much for taking the time to share in this incredible journey of survival and ultimate justice. If you found a piece of your own struggle reflected in this narrative, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Senior Echo Stories. We have an entire collection of gripping emotional journeys waiting for you right here on the screen. Please consider sharing this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own inherent strength and value today. I wish you all a truly beautiful week filled with genuine connection, absolute peace, and the profound courage to build the reality you deeply deserve.